for today, like I said, we're going to talk briefly about the history of psychology. I will tell you that I have never been super interested in history. It was probably one of my worst subjects when I was in school. I always found it a little bit boring to just like listen to people listing off dates or whatever. But I think that, obviously I'm interested in psychology, so anything related to that is going to be a little more interesting to me. I think it's also just really important to kind of give you a little bit of context to make sense of like how we got to where we are today and sort of some of the history of how people have thought about psychology in the past, because it kind of makes the things that we do today make a little bit more sense. So that's the main reason that we're talking about this. So some of the key things that I want you to really focus on today is, first of all, there's this kind of like pendulum swing in the history of psychology, like the history of a lot of things, where we're often swinging back and forth between like two kind of extreme views. So one view will dominate for maybe a few decades or whatever, and then there will be kind of a reaction to that, and we'll go in sort of the opposite extreme. So kind of the two main pendulums in psychology. One is kind of swinging back and forth between a more like philosophical view of psychology and a more scientific view of psychology. So by philosophical, I mean kind of just like talking about theoretically, what we think the mind is or what we think human behavior is like. Whereas the scientific perspective is more like, making systematic observations, using the scientific method, developing hypotheses, creating experiments. So there's kind of this pendulum swing back and forth between those two approaches. There's also a pendulum swing back and forth between focusing on our inner thoughts, which are pretty much invisible. Like right now, you could be thinking about anything in the world. You could be thinking very deeply about what I'm talking about. You could be thinking about like pink elephants. You could be thinking about what you ate for breakfast this morning. And there's absolutely no way for me to know that because I can't see inside your head, right? So some psychologists or movements really focus on those inner thoughts. Others focus more on observable behaviors. So I can see that some of you are taking notes. I can see that some of you are making eye contact with me. I can see that some of you are looking at the PowerPoint. All those things are observable. And so there's kind of this swing back and forth between, do we want to focus on inner thoughts or do we want to focus on what's observable? So you'll see that as I talk about specific movements today, that there's kind of that back and forth. And then we'll end today by talking about contemporary psychology, so where are we now? And one of the main things I want you to notice is that psychology is not a monolith, it's not a single thing. There are tons of subfields within psychology that are all very different from each other. They all have very different methods that they use, very different questions that they're trying to answer, different goals, different functions. So we'll talk a little bit about some of those subfields, although we can never get to all of them. So feel free at any point, not just today, but any time in class, feel free to ask questions, make comments. I don't love just standing up here talking by myself. If something doesn't make sense, ask me. If something reminds you of something else you heard in another class, something you saw in a movie, I don't care, shout it out. Okay, so this slide kind of has a lot of information, but we're going to go through each of these movements, sort of individually. For each movement, I've listed just a couple of the prominent figures who pioneered, really important theories within those fields. But there are always a lot more people who are working behind the scenes, of course. Another thing I'll point out now that you might notice as I'm talking is that psychology, like a lot of academic fields, for most of its history, was very exclusive and intentionally tended to exclude people who were from marginalized groups. So you will notice that a lot of these names are rich white dudes, pretty much. Okay, so I've tried to mention a few women, people of color whenever it's possible, but they were often, like I said, intentionally excluded from the field. So there aren't a lot of those names here. So one of the very first kind of ideas in psychology, the first movements to try to understand human behavior, was called structuralism. And this would have been probably late 1800s. I don't expect you to memorize dates, but just to kind of give you a little bit of context of where we are here. So maybe late 1800s, early 1900s, somewhere around there. And structuralism was basically, it was one of those fields that was very focused on inner thoughts. And so Wilhelm Wundt and his student Edward Titchener were kind of the pioneers of this movement. And essentially what they were trying to do was to kind of uncover how our internal thoughts and representations worked. And so the kind of the things that they would do, they sound silly now, but they would, for example, have people come and look at like a pencil, and they would talk in as much detail about their experience of that pencil and kind of what their internal representation of that pencil was. And they were often trained to do it in a really specific way to avoid like certain words, like they couldn't just say that's a pencil. They would have to say in detail, like, okay, there's this kind of long object that has, you know, highlights and shadows in certain places and certain colors here, and when I touch it, it feels grainy or whatever. Like, they're trying to talk in as much detail about what is their experience of this pencil. So they're kind of trying to take those inner thoughts and like vocalize them so that they are something that could be observed. And they called that process introspection. And from that, you know, again, it sounds kind of silly, but one of the foundational things that they came up with is this idea that our internal representations have three basic elements. So there are sensations, so that's kind of what I was just describing, like what's your experience of the object. There are images, which are essentially like internal ideas that we have. And then there are affections or emotions. So Luntz and Tenscher came up with this idea that all of our internal thoughts are made up of those three basic elements or components. And again, that's sensations, images, and affections. So that was structuralism, very philosophical, very focused on inner thoughts. Functionalism was kind of the reaction to that, where these people were basically like, hey, this stuff you're doing with pencils is stupid, it's not really getting us anywhere, it doesn't make a lot of sense, it's not moving us forward as a field, so let's try to focus on things that are more observable and do it from a more like scientific perspective. Functionalism was also really inspired by like Darwin and theories of evolution, biologists, things like that. So they focused more on kind of biological processes. I'm not going to say a bunch about them, but I will say functionalism led eventually to behaviorism, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So functionalism is really kind of like the foundation of behaviorism, which we'll go into more detail in just a minute. Let's see. William James is sometimes credited as being like the father of psychology. So he was kind of like one of the first ones to try to make psychology an actual science, kind of take it out of the realm of philosophy and move it into a more scientific perspective. I have Mary Calkins listed under functionalism, but really she was one of the few that tried to like combine structuralism and functionalism. So every once in a while you have someone who doesn't like the pendulum swing, doesn't like to be on the extremes, wants to try to like put those two views together, and Mary Calkins was one of those. So she tried to kind of resolve those two very different views. All right, next came psychoanalysis, which if you know anything about psychology, even if you've never heard this word or these names, probably your view of psychology is very much based in psychoanalysis. So how many of you have heard of Sigmund Freud? Okay. How many of you have heard of like anyone else that's listed? You maybe have heard of like Pavlov and Thorndike and some of those. Okay. But probably, how many of you have heard of any of the names I've said so far? All right, so Freud is like this huge figure in psychology. Everybody has at least heard of him and kind of knows a little bit about him, who he was, what his ideas were. So psychoanalysis, again, is focused mostly on inner thoughts. So we have structuralism as inner thoughts, functionalism is the other way to observable behavior, psychoanalysis we're swinging back to inner thoughts. But Freud was really the one who pioneered like modern day talk therapy. So if you think about, what a therapist does or what most of us think of as therapy, you go, you sit and you talk to a therapist about, childhood traumas and issues and things like that. Freud was really the first one that kind of started that technique or that process. We will talk a little bit more about Freud later in the quarter when we talk about like personality and like diagnosing disorders, things like that. I will say, I think Freud gets way too much credit. He had a lot of issues in his methods. So, for example, his theories were all based originally off of a patient that he never even saw or met himself. So there was another doctor, a physician that he kind of worked with. He knew this person, and that physician told Freud about one of his patients, and then Freud came up with all these theories and ideas without ever even seeing the patient himself, which by today's scientific standards would not be accepted or valid or allowed. He also, was very restrictive in the types of patients that he would eventually see. So once he started doing therapy, he pretty much only saw like Victorian women who were in kind of like young to middle adulthood. So, anything about his theories, did they generalize beyond that population? I don't know, because he was very limited to a very specific patient set that he was working with. He also, one of the things we'll talk about later, he had this belief that every human issue could be boiled down to either sex or aggression. Those were the driving forces of everything. And most people who followed him, even the people who really followed him directly, like his direct students, pretty much threw all that out because they're there's way more complexity to human behavior than just sex and aggression. So there's a lot of issues with Freud, is what I will say. He was also a cocaine addict, so that's another thing to maybe keep in mind as we talk about Freud. But having said all of that, he started talk therapy, which we use now. He was mostly focused, like I said, on trying to uncover childhood traumas, what kinds of things happen in your childhood with your parents or caregivers that might then lead to issues like anxiety and depression later on. Melanie Klein, she used Freud's methods and worked mostly with children. So instead of focusing on just Victorian women who were young to middle adults, she took some of his ideas and theories and used them to help children who were suffering from trauma and other issues. All right, so again, just to kind of recap, structuralism, inner thoughts, philosophical, functionalisms were behavior, scientific, psychoanalysis, we're back to inner thoughts and philosophy. So the behaviorism, we're swinging the other way. So behaviorism, very much focused on observable behaviors and using the scientific method and doing it in a very strict, controlled way. So you might have heard of some of the behaviorists. How many of you have heard of Pavlov? As the dogs, the salivating dogs with the bell. Does that sound familiar at all? Okay. So most of these people I have listed under behaviorism actually worked with animals instead of people. But a lot of the ideas and theories that they uncovered working with animals apply to humans. So that's why we talk about them in psychology. So let's see, Pavlov, Thorndike, and Skinner are probably the biggest names here. Pavlov, like I said, he was the one that worked with dogs with the bells. So he developed theories on what's called classical conditioning, which again is something we'll talk about in more detail later. Edward Thorndike used kind of similar techniques to Pavlov. He worked mostly with cats and I think rats, or I think Skinner was the rat guy actually. So Pavlov was dogs, Thorndike was cats, Skinner was rats mostly for whatever reason. One of the reasons that they liked working with animals instead of people, well, I'll ask you, why do you think? If you're obsessed with we want observable behaviors, we want control, we want experiments, why do you think they would work with animals instead of people? Yes?
It's a lot easier to tell animals what to do.
Yes, it is a lot easier to tell them what to do. It's a lot easier to just control their environment, right? I can take a dog or a cat or a mouse and lock it in a cage, and I can control when I turn the lights on and when I turn the lights off. I can control what food it eats and how often it eats. I can control if it has access to, mates or peers or socialization. I can control every aspect of that animal's life, so it makes it a lot easier to test theories experimentally. We cannot, ethically do that to humans. So that's why they worked closely with animals. Let's see. So again, we'll talk quite a bit more about Pavlov, Thorndike, and Skinner later. Mary Jones actually took some of those ideas from animals. She was one of the few that worked with humans, and she actually worked with children. So some of the ideas that came out of the behaviorists, they would do things for example, with their dogs or their cats or their mice, they might give them a reward for a particular behavior. So you think about, oftentimes when I talk about Pavlov and Thorndike, I think about training my dog is kind of where you get the most direct application. So if you want to teach your dog to sit, you tell it sit, you give it a treat every time it does it correctly. And over time it'll learn, okay, if I sit, if I do the thing I'm supposed to do, then I'll get a treat. So I'm going to sit when my owner tells me to sit, right? Those are the kinds of things that they were doing, basically. Mary Jones took those techniques and used them to help condition children who had fears to not be afraid of that thing anymore. So let's say you have a kid who has a really extreme phobia of animals, and every time an animal comes near, they freak out, they cry, they scream. Well, you could use some of those conditioning techniques to try to make the child more comfortable. So every time the animal comes close, let's give this kid some candy, let's give it its favorite toy, let's give it something that's rewarding, so over time it'll start to like that animal instead of being scared of it. Does that make sense? So she was working with people, mostly with children, trying to help like condition or desensitize fears. Let's see, Margaret Washburn, she was kind of similar to Pavlov, Thorndike, and Skinner. She used a lot of the same techniques working with animals, but she was kind of like Mary Calkins in that she's trying to resolve this idea of like observable behaviors and internal thoughts are both important. Like it's good to use the scientific method to focus on what we can see and observe and measure, but whenever you give this dog a treat and it's rewarded for its behavior, there's something going on in that dog's mind. There's something happening in his brain that's causing it to learn that, and it's important that we uncover and understand both the observable behavior and the inner thoughts so that we get like the whole picture. So Washburn was really focused on that. Washburn, I have the little like star or whatever beside her because she was the first woman to receive her PhD in psychology in 1894 is when she got her PhD. I think, is it Mary Calkins? Is she the only other woman on here? I think it was Mary Calkins that finished all of the requirements to get a PhD at Harvard, but they refused at that time to give women PhDs, so she never actually got the degree. So Washburn is the one that's credited with being the first woman to receive it. All right, so then that brings us to humanism. Humanism is maybe a little bit different from the others as far as like the pendulum swing or whatever. The main thing about humanism is that it tends to be much more positive focused. So everything else that came before it was really focused on finding like abnormal behaviors, things that we typically think of as negative, and trying to treat those. Humanism is more focused on like, let's find the positive and strengthen that or, enable that basically. You might have heard the name Maslow. So Maslow came up with something called the hierarchy of needs, which we'll talk about more later. Eleanor Criswell is the most contemporary. I think she's actually still alive, I believe. I think she's the only person on this entire list that's actually still alive. Although I think she's like retired, so she's like definitely elderly at this point. But she focuses on things like using yoga and meditation to help improve positive psychology outcomes. Okay, that was a lot. Let me take a breath for a second. So that's kind of historically what led us to, well, I guess we have one more slide on history, which I'll get to in just a second. But this gets us almost to modern times. Any questions about anything I've covered so far? Okay, so all of this brings us up to around like the 1950s or 1960s, where there was something called the cognitive revolution, which really drastically changed the way that we approach psychology in kind of modern times. There's a few things that happened all at the same time that led to this kind of huge movement. One is that we had the rise of computers. So at this point, they had started developing computers in a way that definitely not everyday people had access to it, but researchers at universities, things like that, had access to computers. And computers, they did a huge number of things to help us with our understanding of psychology. One is just that you can use computers to do some pretty fancy statistical things that we can't really do very well as humans, like on paper or using our own minds. So it helped with just like computations is one of them. Another, I think, more interesting thing, though, is that computers gave us a concrete thing that we could use as a metaphor to try to understand the mind and the brain. So one of the things I will often come back to, especially in the first few weeks of this class, as we talk about like biological stuff in psychology, is this metaphor between the mind or the brain and computers. And I want to start by saying, first of all, that is a metaphor. So anytime you hear me talking about that, I don't literally mean that the brain is a computer, but there are a huge number of similarities between the way that the human brain works and the way that a computer works, and that's not by accident. Part of that is by design. So there's kind of this like relationship between psychologists and neuroscientists and computer scientists, where computer scientists will take what we know about the human brain and try to use that to make computers more efficient and more effective. So we kind of, in a way, have almost designed computers to be similar to the human brain. So that's part of why there's so much similarity. But so like, for example, it's fine if what the terms that I say, if they make no sense to you, don't worry about it. I'm just giving you examples. If you happen to know things about computers, this might make sense to you. Whenever we talk about memory later, I'll use words like encoding, consolidation, storage, and if you know a lot about computers, those words might sound familiar to you. Because in computers, we're encoding information, it's getting stored in like a hard drive. There's a process that helps consolidate files so that they're easier to access. And human memory works in a lot of really similar ways. So we'll see kind of this overlap between computers and the brain. But the main thing is, okay, now we have this physical thing out in the world that kind of represents our mind that we can tinker with and play with. And we can come up with words to talk about it that then make it easier to talk about the mind and the brain. Another thing, this is the last thing I'll say about computers for now. We can also use computers to create like simulations, kind of, to try to test how the mind works. So if I have a theory about how the mind works, let's say, for example, I come up with a theory about how I can recognize this pen. Something we'll talk about later. Something we take for granted all the time. I can just stare at this and recognize it immediately. It's kind of amazing that I can do that, especially if I've never seen this particular pen before, right? So let's say I come up with a theory about how I do that. I have all these steps that I think my brain is doing to try to recognize this pen. Well, then I can make a computer program that follows those same steps and see if the computer program recognizes the pin with the same speed and accuracy as I do. If it does, then maybe my theory is right. If it doesn't, then there's probably something wrong with my theory. So we can also use computers to try to make simulations of the theories we have in psychology to test them. So all of that changed the way that we look at the mind and the brain. In addition to that, we also had some really profound advances in neuroscience. So we started to develop some neuroimaging techniques, things like CAT scans, MRI scans. Some of you may have had those before, where we can actually take pictures of the brain without having to cut your skull open or dissect your brain or whatever, and just take a CAT scan or an MRI. We also have things like fMRI, which actually tracks the activity in the brain. So it's not just a static picture, it's more like a video that shows you this part of the brain is active whenever I'm reading, but it's not active when I'm not reading, for example. So you take the computer stuff, the neuroscience stuff, you put that together, and we suddenly have a way to scientifically observe our inner thoughts, basically. So it kind of resolves that pendulum swing. Now we don't have to focus on either inner thoughts or observable behaviors. We don't have to just be philosophical or scientific. We can take all those things, combine them together, and study them all at once. So we try to see the big picture, basically. So some of the dominant names at this time, Ulrich Neisser published the first textbook in cognitive psychology. So again, that would have been around the 1960s. Noam Chomsky did a lot of work understanding language and how we learn language, how we use language. And he used a lot of cognitive methods and ideas to study that. Let me look at my notes, make sure I didn't miss anything. Any questions about cognitive revolution? All right, so that finally does bring us up to today, to contemporary psychology. So now the field of psychology, like I said, is this very diverse kind of thing that has all these different subfields. And these are not, by any means, this is not an exhaustive list. This is just some of the most dominant ones or the most common ones. So one of them is cognitive psychology. So again, that comes a lot out of the cognitive revolution. That is what I have a degree in. So I have a PhD in cognitive psychology. That's kind of my area of expertise. So cognitive psychology is going to focus mostly on things like sensation and perception. How do I recognize this pen? Our memory. We have lots of different memory systems. How do each of those memory systems work? Why do we forget some things or remember other things? Language is a big part of cognitive psychology. How do we learn language? How do we use language? How do we make sense of it? Attention, how are you right now dividing your attention between note-taking and me talking? Those would all fall kind of in the realm of cognitive psychology. Biopsychology would be like neuroscience, but it could also cover other parts of the body and how those relate to psychology. Evolutionary psychology is one that we will kind of touch on here and there. So evolutionary psychology is basically taking the concepts of evolution and applying them to human behavior. So kind of the idea behind evolutionary psychology is that our brains drive most of our behavior and our thoughts and our attitudes, and our brains evolve just like any other organ in our body, right? We evolved to walk upright, we evolved legs, and we evolved to have hair on our head. We also evolved our brains to be the particular way that they are, and that drives, certain behaviors. So we'll come back to evolutionary psychology quite a bit. Developmental psychology, as the name implies, is like focusing on how we develop basically from birth to death. Social psychology is more focused on how the society impacts an individual and vice versa. Personality psychology is mostly about trying to understand, it's in the name, trying to understand people's personalities, what makes up different traits of a personality, how stable are those traits over a lifetime. One of the newest ones on the list here is what's called industrial organizational psychology. That is essentially more like psychology in a workplace. So trying to understand what makes people like efficient workers, what keeps people happy in their jobs. If you're interested in a career in psychology, industrial organizational psychology is the most lucrative of the subfields probably, at least currently, and it's projected to grow quite a bit. So if you want a job in psychology and you want to make a lot of money, that's probably the way to go. Health psychology, again, kind of in the name, is focused on how our health impacts our mental well-being and vice versa. Would also focus on things like how to get people to quit smoking or how to get people to exercise more. Clinical psychology, that all relates back to like psychoanalysis. That's kind of probably what you think of when you think of psychology. That's therapy, that's counseling. And then forensic psychology is sort of applying psychology in a law setting. So that could be trying to understand, like profile serial killers, for example, or profile, certain types of criminals. It could also be trying to understand how to improve the justice system based on what we know of psychology, like how to improve eyewitness testimony, things like that. So that was just kind of a very brief overview of some of the subfields here. Are there any subfields any of you know about that aren't listed here? Anything you would expect to be listed that isn't?
So, like, would personality be like what narcissists and sociopaths and stuff fall under?
That would probably be more. So there is kind of an overlap between like personality psychology and clinical psychology. So what you're talking about would be like abnormal personality, like disorders. But personality psychology could also focus on, if you've ever heard of like the big 5 personality traits, there's like openness, extroversion, neuroticism, conscientiousness. It's studying like that, like what makes a personality, and what are the different traits that could possibly make that up? What does that correlate with, right? Like if you're more extroverted, are you more likely to succeed in education, for example? So yeah, but there would be a little bit of that, like personality disorders would fall around as well. Some questions? Any others? Okay, well,